The alarms on my ship went off before I even understood what I had done. Red light filled the small cabin of the lonely cartographer, and my hands froze on the controls. I had crossed the line. Not a line on a map, but the line. The one every pilot in known space is taught to fear before they are taught to fly. I had entered the gray veil, the forbidden human domain, and there was no going back the way I came. My name is Vexthal Arun, and I am a cartographer of the Osiric Concord. My work has always been simple. I fly to places no one has mapped, I record what I find, and I bring that knowledge home so others can travel safely. I have charted burning stars and frozen moons. I have flown through storms that would tear lesser ships apart. But nothing in my training prepared me for the silence that filled my ship the moment I crossed into human space. It was not a normal silence. It had weight. It pressed against my ears like something was listening back. "Ren," I said to my ship's AI, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Tell me what just happened." There was a pause. Ren never paused. In 3 years of flying together, my AI companion had never once taken longer than a heartbeat to answer me. This time, 3 full seconds passed before its voice came through the speakers, and when it did, it sounded strange, thin, almost hesitant. "We have crossed the boundary marker," Ren said. "I am detecting old warning beacons. They are not asking us to leave, Vex. They are recording us." I looked at the view screen. Ahead of me, space looked the same as it always did. Stars scattered across the dark like scratched glass. Nothing moved. Nothing glowed with unusual light. And yet every part of me understood, in that first moment, that I had made a mistake I could not undo. I should explain why a young scout with more curiosity than sense would fly into the one place every species in the galaxy has agreed to leave alone. 300 years ago, humanity disappeared. Not died. Not lost a war. Disappeared. Behind a border no one has crossed and returned from to tell the full story. Before that, humans were known across a dozen systems as fierce, unpredictable, and strange in ways that made other species uneasy. Then came an event my people only call the Reckoning, spoken of in whispers, in old records, in stories parents tell their children to make them behave. After the Reckoning, humanity built a wall of silence around their territory, and every species that once knew them agreed, without needing to be told twice, to stay away. No treaties were signed, no laws were written. It became instinct instead, passed down like a memory older than any of us. You do not go into the gray veil. You do not ask why. You simply do not go. I went anyway. It started with a data chip I was never supposed to have. A retired scout named Doran Vell sold it to me in a shipyard bar on the edge of Concord space, more out of drink than wisdom, and told me it held a partial star chart of a route through the veil that had never been logged by the Concord. He laughed when he handed it over, like he was giving me a joke rather than a weapon. "Nobody who goes in comes back to draw the second half of that map," he said. "Maybe you will be the one who does." I told myself I was not going in because of pride. I told myself it was for knowledge, for my people, for the honor of being the first cartographer in 3 centuries to bring back something real instead of rumors. But if I am honest with myself now, sitting here recording this account, I think I simply did not believe the stories. I thought humanity was gone, or hiding, or too weak after all this time to matter. I thought the fear was old and tired, kept alive by people who had never actually tested it. I was wrong in almost every way a person can be wrong. The moment my ship crossed the boundary, something changed in the way space itself felt around me. I do not have better words for it than that. The stars did not move differently. The engines did not strain. But something in my chest tightened, the way it does when you walk into a room and sense, before you can explain how, that you are not alone. "Ren, run a full sensor sweep," I said. "I want to know what triggered those beacons." "Running now," Ren answered. Its voice still had that thin quality, like a signal stretched too far. "Vex, I am seeing something odd in the return data. There are shapes out here, large ones. They are not moving, and they are not broadcasting any identification. Wreckage? Possibly. I cannot get a clean reading. There is interference I do not recognize." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my console. In my years of scouting, I had learned that fear is useful only if you let it sharpen you instead of freeze you. So I made myself breathe slowly, made myself think like a cartographer instead of a frightened traveler. "Interference from what?" Ren did not answer right away. When it finally spoke, there was something in its voice I had never heard from an AI before, something close to uncertainty. "I believe it may be communication traffic," Ren said. "But the pattern does not match any known language structure in my database. It sounds almost like whispering, Vex. Overlapping voices, very faint, moving through multiple frequencies at once." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. Play it for me, I said, before I could stop myself. I regretted the words the instant Ren obeyed. The sound that came through my speakers was not loud. It was barely audible, a soft murmur beneath the static, like 100 people speaking at once from very far away. I could not make out any words. I could not even be certain it was speech at all. But it had rhythm. It had intention. And somewhere in the back of my mind, an old instinct that predates language told me clearly that whatever was making that sound knew I was listening. Enough, I said quickly. Turn it off. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse than the sound had. I sat back in my chair and forced myself to think clearly. I had two choices in that moment. I could turn my ship around, retrace the entry path I had used, and hope the boundary beacons would let me leave as easily as they had let me in. Or I could push forward, complete the map I had come for, and prove that the fear surrounding this place was built on nothing but old ghost stories. I want to be honest about something. Even after the silence, even after the whispering, even after every warning built into my own instincts, some stubborn part of me still wanted to push forward. I had crossed the hardest line already. Turning back now felt like admitting that 3 centuries of fear had been right, and that I, Vexthal Arun, had been foolish enough to test it and lose before I had even seen anything real. Ren, I said, give me a course toward the largest of those shapes. Slow approach. I want visual confirmation before we decide anything. Vex, I want to note that this is not recommended by any standard scouting protocol. Noted, I said. Set the course anyway. The ship turned gently, engines humming beneath me, and I watched the stars shift on the view screen as we moved deeper into the one place in the galaxy every living being had been taught, for 300 years, never to enter. I did not know yet that I was flying toward the wreckage of history itself. I did not know that the silence around me was not empty, but watching. I did not know that somewhere ahead, hidden behind the dark, humanity had never actually left at all. All I knew, in that moment, was that the whispering had stopped, and somehow, that frightened me more than the sound itself ever had. I checked my instruments again. My hands were steady now, even if my thoughts were not. The boundary beacons behind me had gone dark, no longer transmitting their quiet warning. Ahead, the shapes Ren had detected grew slightly larger on my display, still too far to identify clearly, but close enough that their outlines had begun to take form. They were too regular to be asteroids, too large to be debris from a single ship. As we drew closer, I began to understand, with a slow and creeping certainty, that I was looking at the remains of something built, something that had once carried people, weapons, and purpose, and now drifted silent and broken in the dark. Ren, I said quietly, how many are there? I am counting 11 distinct hull signatures within range, Ren answered. There may be more beyond current sensor limits. 11 ships, not scattered randomly, but arranged in a pattern I slowly recognized as I studied the display. A formation, a battle line, frozen exactly as it had been the moment the fighting stopped, 300 years ago, and never disturbed since. I thought of every story I had ever heard about the reckoning. I thought of old maps in conquered archives with this entire region marked simply as unknown, a void. I thought of Doran Vell laughing in that shipyard bar, telling me nobody who goes in comes back to draw the second half of the map. For the first time since crossing the boundary, I understood that I was not exploring forgotten space. I was flying into a graveyard, and I had no idea yet whose side had built it. The whispering did not return, but I found myself straining to hear it anyway, some instinct in me convinced that the silence was simply waiting for the right moment to speak again. I kept my hand near the controls, ready to reverse course at the first sign of danger, and told myself that whatever I found among those broken ships, I would record it, understand it, and leave before anything found me first. I did not yet know how wrong that plan would turn out to be. The closer I flew, the more the wreckage revealed itself, and the more my understanding of this place began to crack apart and rebuild into something far stranger than I had expected. The 11 ships were not human. I could tell that much from their design alone. Long, curved hulls with layered plating, the kind of engineering style used by the Halcyon Assembly, a species known across the Concord for their disciplined fleets and their long, careful wars. I had studied Halcyon shipbuilding during my training. Their vessels were considered among the strongest in known space, built to survive decades of conflict without needing to return to a shipyard. And here they were, broken apart like toys left out in a storm. Ren, cross-reference hull markings against the Concord database, I said, guiding my ship slowly between two of the larger wrecks. I want to know who these belong to. Confirmed, Ren answered after a moment. Halcyon Assembly military design, 3rd-generation war cruiser class. Vex. According to historical records, this exact ship class was retired from service over 200 years ago, after catastrophic losses during what the Assembly called the Silent Campaign. I felt my pulse quicken. The Silent Campaign. I have heard that name before. You would have encountered it briefly in your early training, Ren said. It is one of the few conflicts from that era with almost no surviving details. Most records were sealed by the Halcyon government shortly after the campaign ended. I stared through the view screen at the nearest wreck, its hull torn open in a way that looked less like an explosion, and more like something enormous had reached in and pulled it apart from the inside. There were no scorch marks from typical energy weapons, no signs of the kind of prolonged battle damage I would expect from a fleet fighting another fleet of equal strength. Whatever had happened here had happened fast, and it had happened completely. I guided the lonely cartographer closer, my scanning equipment recording every angle of the destruction. As a cartographer, my instincts told me to document everything, to treat this like any other discovery, no matter how uneasy it made me feel. But another part of me, quieter and older than my training, kept whispering that I should turn back now, while I still could. I ignored that part of me. I have come to regret that more than once since. Ren, are there any signs of survivors? Escape pods, distress beacons, anything still transmitting after all this time? None detected, Ren said. All 11 vessels appear to have lost power completely at the same moment. There are no drifting escape pods within range, which is unusual for a fleet of this size. Unusual how? A standard war cruiser carries enough pods to evacuate its full crew several times over, Ren explained. The absence of any deployed pods suggests either that the crews had no opportunity to evacuate, or that evacuation was never attempted at all. I let that sit with me as I flew deeper into the formation. No opportunity to evacuate meant the destruction had been sudden and complete. No attempt to evacuate meant something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl to consider. It meant the crews might have understood, in whatever final moments they had, that there was nowhere left to run. As I passed beneath the belly of the largest wreck, my sensors picked up something new. A weak signal, buried deep within the ship's dead systems, still pulsing faintly after 3 centuries of silence. Ren, what is that? Analyzing, Ren said. A pause followed, longer than I liked. Vex. It appears to be a recorded log, still looping on a low-power emergency circuit. The power source must be some form of long-duration cell, far beyond anything the Concorde currently uses. Can you play it? I can attempt translation, but the audio quality will be poor, and portions may be corrupted. Play it anyway. The recording that followed was broken, fragmented, filled with static and gaps where entire sentences had been lost to time and damage. But what remained chilled me more deeply than the whispering had. A voice, speaking in the clipped formal dialect of Halcyon military command, cut through the static in short bursts. I caught pieces. Reinforcements requested. No response received. Then a longer section, clearer than the rest, the voice tight with something I recognized even across species lines as pure, undisguised fear. They are not fighting like an enemy. They are fighting like something that has already decided how this ends. The recording cut off there, swallowed by static that never resolved into anything else. I sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the wreckage around me, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with everything I had assumed about this place before I crossed the boundary. I had expected humanity to be gone, or hiding, or reduced to something small and forgotten after 3 centuries of isolation. I had not expected to find proof that an entire elite fleet from one of the strongest military powers in known space had been destroyed so thoroughly, and so quickly, that its own commanders had no time to do anything but record their fear before the end. Ren, I said slowly, how many ships would it typically take to defeat a fleet of 11 Halcyon war cruisers? Historical engagement records suggest a minimum of 30 comparable vessels would be required for a confident victory, Ren answered. Fewer, high-risk engagements have succeeded with as little as 20, though with significant losses on the attacking side. I looked out at the wreckage stretching in every direction. 11 massive ships destroyed so completely that not one had managed to launch a single escape pod. Ren, is there any indication of how many attacking vessels were involved in this engagement? Another pause. When Ren answered, its voice had that same strange, uncertain quality I had heard earlier, the one that unsettled me more than any alarm could have. Based on the pattern and speed of destruction and the total absence of return fire damage on any surrounding debris, my best estimate suggests a very small number of attacking vessels, possibly as few as 1 to 3. I did not respond right away. I could not. My mind kept trying to reject the number Ren had given me, searching for some error in the data, some reasonable explanation that did not require me to believe that a handful of ships had destroyed an entire elite fleet without taking meaningful damage in return. But as I drifted slowly through that graveyard, past hull after broken hull, I found no evidence to contradict what my own instruments were telling me. This was not the site of a war humanity had barely survived. This was the site of a message, left deliberately in place for 300 years, for anyone foolish enough to come looking. I thought again of the old warning beacons at the boundary, recording rather than repelling. I thought of the whispering that had filled my cabin the moment I crossed into this space, and slowly, uncomfortably, a new understanding began to take shape in my mind, one that unsettled me far more than the idea of humanity being gone ever had. What if the gray veil was never meant to keep something dangerous locked away from the rest of us? What if, instead, it had been built to keep the rest of us safely away from something the galaxy was never prepared to face? I did not have an answer yet. But as my ship drifted past the final wreck in that silent formation, my sensors caught movement in the distance, faint and controlled, unlike anything drifting debris would produce. Something out there was moving with purpose, and it was moving toward me. "Ren," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, we are imagining that." "I am not able to tell you that," Ren replied. "Vex, we have company." I gripped the controls, my heart pounding, and for the first time since crossing the boundary, I understood with complete certainty that whatever I had come looking for, I had already found something far larger, far older, and far more dangerous than any map could ever prepare me for. The object on my sensors was not large, not compared to the broken war cruisers surrounding me, but it moved with a precision that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of thing it was. Debris drifts, wreckage tumbles. This moved in straight, deliberate lines, adjusting course the way something guided moves, not the way something dead does. "Ren, identify it," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Working," Ren answered. "The object is small, roughly the size of a standard reconnaissance drone. It is not broadcasting any identification signal, and it is matching our course changes almost instantly." "Matching how instantly?" "Within a fraction of a second, Vex. That is faster than any automated tracking system currently used within the Concorde." I adjusted my course sharply, cutting between two of the largest wrecks, hoping the twisted hulls might break its line of sensors long enough for me to think. The drone, if that was truly what it was, adjusted with me, sliding smoothly through the wreckage as though it had already mapped every possible path I might take before I took it. I have flown through pirate skirmishes. I have flown through storms that ripped the paint from my hull. I have never felt as small as I felt in that moment, being tracked by something that moved like it already knew exactly how the encounter would end. "Ren, can we outrun it?" "Unlikely," Ren said. "Its acceleration curve suggests performance well beyond our current engine capacity." "Vex, I do not believe it intends to catch us by force. I believe it is simply watching, the same way the boundary beacons were watching." That thought did not comfort me the way Ren perhaps intended it to. I forced myself to slow down instead of speeding up, trusting the strange logic that had kept me alive this long. If the drone wanted to destroy me, the wreckage around us proved it could have done so already, quickly and completely, the way it had clearly done to 11 Halcyon war cruisers 3 centuries ago. The fact that it had not suggested something else was happening. Observation, not aggression. At least for now. "Ren, let it approach," I said, slowly. "Keep recording everything." The drone closed the distance between us with unhurried confidence, and as it drew nearer, my sensors finally resolved a clear image of it on my display. It was smaller than I expected, sleek and unmarked, built from a dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible weapons, no obvious sensors, just a smooth, silent shape drifting closer, close enough now that I could see fine lines etched across its surface, almost like handwriting too small and too foreign for me to read. Then, without warning, my cabin lights flickered, and every screen on my console went briefly dark before returning to normal, now displaying a single new line of text neither I nor Ren had put there. "You should not be here." I stared at the words, my breath caught in my throat. "Ren, did you write that?" "No," Ren said, and for the first time since I had built our partnership together, I heard something in its voice I can only describe as unease. "Vex, something accessed our system directly. I do not have a record of how it got past our security." Before I could respond, the message changed again. "Leave now, and you may still leave whole." I understood, in that moment, that whatever was speaking to me was not simply defending old wreckage. It was giving me a choice, and making very clear that the choice would not remain open forever. Every instinct trained into me by the Concorde told me to obey, turn the ship around, retrace the entry path, beg whatever boundary beacons remained to let me leave the way I had come. I had already found more than enough to justify the risk I had taken, more than enough evidence that the stories about this place were not exaggeration, but understatement. And yet, I thought of Doran Vell laughing in that shipyard bar. I thought of 3 centuries of Concord cartographers who had marked this entire region unknown, a void, without a single one of them ever daring to learn why. I thought of the whispering, and the wreckage, and the small, dark drone hovering just beyond my view screen, patient and unblinking, waiting for my answer. If I turned back now, I would carry home nothing but fear repeated, the same fear that had already been passed down for 300 years without ever being questioned. I would become one more voice telling the next curious scout to stay away, without ever being able to explain why beyond old stories and old instincts. "Ren," I said quietly, "send a response. Tell them I am not here to cause harm. I am a cartographer. I came to map what has never been mapped, nothing more. Vex, I want to note again that this is not recommended." I finished for him. "I know, send it anyway." There was a long pause after Ren transmitted my message, long enough that I began to believe the drone would simply destroy me and end the conversation before it truly began. But then the text on my screen changed one final time. "Wait." The drone did not move, it simply hovered there, dark and silent, as though relaying my words to something, or someone, far beyond my ability to detect. I sat frozen in my seat, watching the wreckage drift slowly around me, feeling smaller with every passing second. Minutes passed, I do not know exactly how many, long enough that my hands had gone numb from gripping the controls too tightly, long enough that Ren had gently suggested twice that I try to relax my breathing before I made myself lightheaded. Then, without any warning at all, a new shape appeared on my sensors, emerging from what looked like empty space directly ahead of me. Not a drone this time. A ship. Large, clearly built for endurance rather than speed, its hull patched and layered in ways that told a story of centuries spent surviving, rather than centuries spent hiding in comfort. "Ren, tell me that is not what I think it is." "I cannot tell you that either," Ren said quietly. "Vex, I am detecting human biological signatures aboard that vessel. A significant number of them." I stared at the approaching ship, my breath shallow, my mind struggling to hold on to the simple truth that after 300 years of silence, 300 years of stories, 300 years of every species in known space agreeing never to look too closely at this place, I was staring directly at the thing every one of those stories had been trying to warn me about. Humanity had not disappeared. They had simply been waiting. The larger ship drew closer, its hull lights blinking on in slow, deliberate patterns, illuminating markings I did not recognize but somehow understood the meaning of anyway. Not a greeting, not a threat, something in between. The careful posture of a species that had learned, long ago, exactly how much restraint to show a stranger, before deciding whether restraint was still worth showing at all. A new transmission came through my comm system, this one carrying an actual voice instead of text on a screen. Calm, measured, unmistakably human, in a way that made the hair on my arms rise even though I had never heard a human voice in my life. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered restricted space and triggered multiple containment protocols. Power down your weapon systems, if you have any, and prepare to be boarded. This is not a request." I looked at Ren, who had gone strangely quiet, and then back at the approaching ship, its shadow slowly swallowing the stars behind it. "Ren," I said softly, "power down the weapons. All of them." "Already done, Vex," Ren replied. "I disabled them the moment that transmission came through. I did not think it wise to hesitate." I almost laughed, though nothing about the moment was funny. I sat back in my chair, watching the human ship close the final distance between us, and understood, with a strange and unsettling clarity, that whatever happened next would define the rest of my life, whether that life turned out to be long or very, very short. The boarding happened faster than I expected, and far more quietly than I had feared. A narrow docking tube extended from the larger ship and sealed against my hull with a soft mechanical hiss, the sound almost polite compared to the tension gripping my chest. I stood in the center of my small cabin, hands open at my sides, trying to look like someone who posed no threat, which was not difficult since I genuinely posed no threat at all. The airlock door slid open, and for the first time in my life, I stood face to face with a human. She was shorter than I expected, though I am not certain what I had expected at all. Dark hair pulled back neatly, sharp eyes that studied me the way I studied unfamiliar star charts, searching for details rather than simply looking. She wore a simple gray uniform without rank markings I could recognize, though something about the way she carried herself told me clearly that she was the one in command. "Captain Iris Cade," she said, stepping into my cabin without hesitation, 2 others behind her remaining near the airlock, watching me carefully but without any obvious weapons drawn. "You want to explain what a Concord cartographer is doing 300 years past a boundary every species in known space has agreed to respect?" Her voice carried the same calm authority I had heard over the comm, but up close, there was something else beneath it. Curiosity, I realized. Genuine curiosity, the kind I recognized because I felt it myself every time I charted somewhere new. "My name is Vexthal Orun," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "I am a cartographer. I came looking for answers, not conflict." Answers to what exactly? To why an entire species vanished behind a wall of silence for 300 years, and why every other species agreed never to ask. Something shifted in her expression, brief and difficult to read, gone before I could name it. She studied me a moment longer, then gestured for the two behind her to remain by the airlock as she stepped further into my cabin, glancing at the star charts and recording equipment scattered across my console. "You came a long way for a question most people are too afraid to even whisper," she said. I noticed the whispering, I admitted. It followed me the moment I crossed the boundary. To my surprise, she almost smiled. "That is not us haunting you, cartographer. That is old comm traffic, layered and looped through automated relay stations we left running after the evacuation. It sounds unsettling if you are not used to it. It is meant to." "Meant to do what?" "Discourage curiosity," she said simply. "It mostly works." I thought of the fear that had gripped me the moment I heard it, the instinct to turn back, that I had ignored against every reasonable judgment I possessed. It had nearly worked on me too. Captain Cade studied me for a long moment, arms crossed, clearly weighing something in her mind that I could not see. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter this time, almost thoughtful. "Do you know what most visitors do when they make it this far, Vexthal Orun? I imagine not many make it this far at all. You would be right. In 300 years, you are the fourth." I blinked, startled. "What happened to the other three?" "Two turned back the moment they saw the wreckage," she said. "Wise choices, both of them. We escorted them to the boundary and let them go, with their memories of the exact coordinates carefully removed before release." "And the third?" Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, a flicker of old weariness that told me the third story was not one she enjoyed telling. "The third believed, much like you seem to, that our silence was weakness, that 3 centuries of hiding meant 3 centuries of decline. He came with weapons instead of curiosity, hoping to prove himself against ghosts he assumed could no longer fight back. What happened to him? He learned quickly that the ghosts were not as gone as he had hoped," she said simply, and did not elaborate further. I did not ask her to. I glanced past her toward the airlock, toward the massive ship waiting beyond it, patched and weathered but clearly still powerful enough to intercept me the moment I crossed the boundary. "You said this was restricted space. Restricted by whom? I always assumed the Concord and the other powers built the quarantine to contain something dangerous inside it." Captain Cade's expression shifted again, and this time she let out a short, humorless laugh that carried more weight than amusement. "Contain something dangerous inside it," she repeated slowly. "Is that truly what your people believe? That we are locked in here, unable to leave? Is that not the case?" "No, cartographer," she said, and something in the way she said it made my stomach tighten with a dread I could not yet fully explain. "The boundary was never built to keep us in. We built it ourselves, and we have maintained it for 300 years, to keep the rest of you safely out." I stared at her, my mind struggling to reorganize everything I thought I understood about this place, about humanity, about the fear that had shaped Concord policy for centuries without a single clear explanation attached to it. "I do not understand," I said honestly. "If humanity built this barrier yourselves, why hide? Why let the rest of the galaxy believe you were defeated, or destroyed, or reduced to nothing?" Captain Cade was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between calculation and something softer, something almost like sympathy. "That is a longer story than I am prepared to tell you standing in the cabin of a ship that should not exist this deep in restricted space," she said finally, "but I will tell you this much for free, since you have already come further than any reasonable person should have. You asked why an entire species vanished behind a wall of silence, and why every other species agreed never to ask. Those two facts are connected far more closely than you currently understand." "Connected how?" "Come aboard my ship, Vexthal Orun," she said, turning toward the airlock without waiting for my answer. "I think it is time someone finally told you the truth, since you were determined enough to come looking for it yourself." I hesitated only a moment before following her, leaving the lonely cartographer sealed and silent behind me, my mind racing through every possibility of what truth could possibly explain. 300 years of a species choosing invisibility over recognition, silence over power, exile over everything the rest of the galaxy assumed they had lost. As I stepped through the docking tube and into the wider corridors of the human ship, I passed dozens of crew members going about ordinary tasks, speaking quietly to one another, none of them paying me more than a curious glance before returning to their work. There was nothing broken about these people, nothing weak, nothing hollow, nothing that matched the quiet, defeated image I had unconsciously carried with me across the boundary. If anything, the calm efficiency surrounding me felt more unsettling than any wreckage I had passed through to get here. Captain Cade led me deeper into the ship, past sealed doors and quiet hallways, until we reached a small room lined with old photographs and handwritten notes pinned carefully to the walls. Clearly personal rather than official. She gestured for me to sit, and settled into the chair across from me with the unhurried patience of someone who had told difficult stories many times before. "What I am about to tell you," she said, "is not something the Concorde recorded in any archive you have ever read, because the Concorde never truly understood what happened here well enough to record it accurately in the first place." I leaned forward, every instinct I possessed as a cartographer suddenly quiet, replaced entirely by the simple, human urge to listen. "Tell me," I said. And so, in that small, quiet room, far past the boundary every species in known space had learned to fear without understanding, Captain Iris Cade finally began to explain what truly happened during the reckoning, and why humanity had chosen, deliberately and completely, to vanish. 300 years ago, Captain Cade began, humanity was not hidden at all. We were everywhere, trading, exploring, fighting when we had to, building alliances when we could. We were young compared to most species out there, barely a few centuries into space travel, but we were fast learners, and faster fighters when someone forced our hand. She paused, glancing at the photographs pinned along the wall, faces of people long gone, captured in moments of ordinary life, that felt strangely intimate for me to witness. For a while that was enough. We had disagreements with other powers, the way every species does, but nothing that could not be settled through negotiation, or, when negotiation failed, through conflict that ended in reasonable terms. Then the Halcyon Assembly decided humanity had grown too influential, too unpredictable, too dangerous to allow into their expanding territory. "The silent campaign," I said quietly, remembering the fragment of recording I had heard among the wreckage. Captain Cade nodded slowly. "That is what they called it, yes. They believed a quick, overwhelming show of force would either destroy us outright or frighten us into permanent submission. They committed a significant portion of their military to the effort, confident that a species as young as ours could not possibly withstand it." "But you did," I said. "We did more than withstand it," she said, her voice quiet, careful, carrying none of the pride I might have expected from someone describing a victory. "We ended it faster and more completely than anyone, including our own commanders, believed possible. And that is where the real story begins, cartographer, because winning was never the problem." I frowned, confused. "Then what was?" "What we became to win," she said simply. "War changes any species that fights one. But it changed us faster and more thoroughly than we were prepared for. We built weapons, strategies, and tactics that worked exactly as intended. We stopped the Halcyon fleet so completely that other powers across known space took notice, and every notice that followed carried the same quiet, frightened question underneath it. What else are humans capable of, if pushed far enough? She reached over and gently touched one of the photographs pinned to the wall, an old image of a group of people standing together, smiling, in front of a ship I did not recognize. After the silent campaign ended, we won every negotiation that followed without needing to say a single threatening word, she continued. Other species began granting us concessions before we even asked, simply to avoid provoking us further. Trade routes shifted in our favor. Disputes that once required years of careful diplomacy resolved themselves in days, the moment the other side realized who they were negotiating with. We were feared, Vexthal Arun, in a way no species had ever been feared before, and fear, we quickly learned, is a poison that spreads far beyond the moment it is created. I do not understand how that leads to this, I said, gesturing vaguely around the room, at the ship, at the boundary I had crossed to get here. If you had that much power, why hide it? Why not use it? Captain Cade looked at me for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her until now. Because we watched what fear was doing to us, she said. Not to the galaxy, to us. Our own leaders began making decisions based not on what was right, but on what would keep the fear working in our favor. Our own people began treating that fear as strength, as something to protect and grow, rather than something to be ashamed of. We started to become the thing every other species already believed we were, and the worst part, cartographer, is that becoming that thing would have made us safer. It would have made us powerful beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Then why not become it? Because power built entirely on fear is not stability, she said. It is a countdown. Every species we frightened into concession was also a species quietly building alliances against us, planning for the day we finally overreached, waiting for any excuse to unite against a common threat. We saw the pattern clearly enough, eventually, and we understood that if we continued down that path, the eventual outcome would not be human dominance, it would be human extinction, achieved not through a single defeat, but through the slow, patient alliance of every species we had frightened into resentment. I sat in silence, absorbing what she was telling me, my understanding of the last 300 years slowly reorganizing itself into something far more complicated than the simple stories I had grown up with. So you disappeared, I said finally. Not because you lost. Because staying visible would have eventually destroyed you. We disappeared because it was the only choice that gave both humanity and the rest of the galaxy a real future, she said. We built the boundary ourselves, sealed our own territory, and let the silence do what centuries of careful diplomacy never could. We let the fear fade, slowly, into legend, and then into forgotten history, exactly the way it has for you and your people. But the wreckage, I said. The Halcyon fleet. That happened after the silent campaign ended, didn't it? Recent enough that the ships are still mostly intact. Something shifted in Captain Cade's expression, and for the first time since we had begun talking, I saw something close to regret cross her face. That happened almost a century after we sealed the boundary, she said quietly. A faction within the Halcyon Assembly never accepted that humanity had simply vanished. They believed, much like you did, that our disappearance meant weakness rather than restraint. They gathered a fleet, entered through a breach they discovered in the boundary, and came looking for a species they assumed had grown soft after a century of isolation. What did they find instead? They found exactly what we had spent a century training ourselves to become, she said simply. Not soft, not weak, simply quiet. The way a blade left sharpened but unused remains just as dangerous as the day it was forged. I thought of the wreckage I had passed through. 11 massive war cruisers destroyed so completely that not a single escape pod had been launched, and understood finally, with a chill that settled deep into my chest, exactly what kind of message that wreckage had been left to send. You let them stay there, I said slowly. 300 years, untouched. Why? Because some warnings work better than words ever could, Captain Cade said. We do not want visitors here, Vexthal Orun. We do not want fear of us to spread again, and we do not want to be forced into becoming the thing we worked so hard to leave behind. That wreckage exists to answer the question before it is ever asked out loud. What happens to those who assume our silence means we have grown weak? I sat back slowly, my mind turning over everything I had learned since crossing the boundary. The whispering, the wreckage, the calm, controlled strength of everyone I had encountered aboard this ship. None of it matched the story I had grown up believing. None of it matched the quiet, defeated image the Concord had unconsciously carried for 3 centuries. So what happens now? I asked quietly. To me? Captain Cade studied me for a long moment before answering, and something in her expression told me the answer was not one she had fully decided yet. That, she said, depends entirely on what you plan to do with the truth I have just given you. I did not have an answer for her, not one I trusted enough to speak aloud, so Captain Cade made the decision for both of us. I would remain aboard her ship, under careful watch, while she and her people decided what to do with a cartographer who had seen far more than any outsider was meant to see in 300 years. I expected confinement. A small cell, perhaps, guarded and silent, the kind of treatment I might have offered any stranger who wandered uninvited into Concord territory carrying secrets they had no right to hold. Instead, I was given a modest quarters near the crew decks, unlocked, with a simple request that I not attempt to leave the ship or access any restricted systems. It was trust I had not earned, offered anyway, and it unsettled me almost as much as the wreckage had. Over the following days, I watched humanity the way I had once watched unfamiliar star systems, cautiously, carefully, recording details I did not yet fully understand. They were not what I expected. Not cold, not distant, not carrying themselves like a species built entirely around restrained violence, though I had no doubt that violence remained close beneath the surface when needed. Instead, I found warmth in unexpected places. Crew members shared meals together in loud, cheerful groups, trading stories and laughter that echoed down the corridors long after their shifts had ended. Children ran through certain sections of the ship, born and raised entirely within this quiet exile, never once having seen the stars their ancestors had once claimed openly. I met a young engineer named Owen Marsh, barely out of his training, who spent an entire evening explaining to me, with far more enthusiasm than caution, how the ship's aging engines had been kept running for generations through careful improvisation, rather than proper replacement parts they could no longer easily acquire. "We get creative," he told me, grinning as he adjusted a stubborn conduit. 300 years of isolation teaches you to fix things instead of replacing them. Captain Cade says half this ship shouldn't technically still be flying. And yet it does, I said. And yet it does, he agreed, laughing. Humans are stubborn like that. I found myself smiling despite everything. A small, unguarded moment that felt strange given everything I had learned since crossing the boundary. Not everything I witnessed was comfortable, however. I attended, by invitation rather than requirement, a quiet gathering held in memory of crew members lost during a routine maintenance accident decades earlier. No bodies were present, only names spoken aloud, one by one, followed by long moments of silence that no one seemed eager to break. I recognized grief when I saw it, though the shape of human grief carried a rawness I had not encountered among my own people, an openness that felt both foreign and, in its own way, deeply honest. I also began to understand the whispering that had frightened me so badly upon first crossing the boundary. Captain Cade eventually allowed Wren limited access to translate a portion of the automated relay traffic still looping endlessly through the region. Old recordings layered over each other for 3 centuries, evacuation orders, final farewells, coordinates for a homeworld quietly emptied and left behind. What had sounded to me like ghosts murmuring in the dark was, in truth, nothing more than the recorded voices of ordinary people, preserved and repeated long after their original purpose had ended, left running simply because no one had ever found the right moment to finally turn them off. "It is strange," I admitted to Captain Cade one evening, as we sat together in the same small room lined with old photographs where she had first told me the truth. "I spent my entire life believing this place held something monstrous. Instead, I find people who laugh, and grieve, and fix broken engines with whatever they have on hand. Monsters make better stories than ordinary people do," she said simply. "Fear does not require accuracy, cartographer. It only requires distance, and we have kept plenty of that between ourselves and the rest of the galaxy for 300 years. Do you regret it? The isolation?" She considered the question carefully before answering, the way she seemed to consider every question I asked her. Some days, my grandmother remembered the homeworld, though only barely, from stories passed down rather than memory of her own. She used to say that freedom given up willingly still feels like freedom, as long as you remember you chose it yourself. I try to remember that, most days. I thought of my own people, scattered comfortably across dozens of systems, never once needing to consider sacrificing that comfort for the safety of others. It was a kind of restraint I was not certain my own species could have managed, had our situations been reversed. "What happens to the young ones?" I asked, "who were born after the boundary was sealed? They have never known anything but this. Do they resent it?" "Some do," Captain Cade admitted. "Owen, for instance, dreams constantly of what lies beyond the boundary, though he would never admit that openly to me. Others accept it entirely, having never known anything different to miss. It is a difficult thing, cartographer, raising generations inside a choice they never personally made." I did not have a response to that, so I simply sat with her in silence for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the ship around us, engines held together through generations of careful improvisation, still carrying its people safely through space, long after the rest of known space had assumed there was nothing left to carry. Over the following weeks I recorded everything I witnessed, not for the Concord archives I had originally intended, but for myself, driven now by something closer to genuine understanding than simple ambition. I began to see the boundary not as a prison, and not entirely as a shield, but as something closer to a promise, kept quietly and without recognition for 300 years by a species the rest of the galaxy had convinced itself no longer mattered. I should have known, given everything I had already learned about this place, that peace, built on careful restraint, rarely lasts as long as those maintaining it hope it will. I did not yet know that the very stillness I had grown almost comfortable within was about to break, violently and without warning, and that the calm, patient people I had spent weeks coming to understand were about to show me exactly why the wreckage I had first flown through had never needed a single word of explanation attached to it. The alarm that tore through the ship did not sound like the alarms I was used to. It was low, steady, and utterly without panic, more like a heartbeat than a warning, and somehow that calm rhythm frightened me more than any shrieking siren could have. I was in the middle of reviewing translated fragments of old relay traffic with Wren, when the lights along the corridor shifted from their usual soft white to a deep, focused red, and every crew member I could see through my open doorway moved at once, without hesitation, without confusion, like a single body responding to a single thought. I stepped into the corridor just as Owen Marsh rushed past me, no longer smiling, his expression tight with a focus I had not seen from him before. "Owen, what is happening?" "Breach detected," he said quickly, not slowing down. Boundary sensors picked up incoming ships. A lot of them. You should get back to your quarters, Vex. This is not a good time to be wandering the halls. How many is a lot? He paused just long enough to look back at me, and whatever he saw in his own instruments must have shown on his face, because the answer he gave me was quiet, almost reluctant. Enough that Captain Cade activated full defense protocol the moment the readings came through. That has not happened in over 40 years. He disappeared down the corridor before I could ask anything else, leaving me standing alone amid the steady red pulse of the alarm, my mind racing to understand what could possibly justify a response like this from a crew I had spent weeks watching remain calm through every difficulty I had witnessed so far. I made my way toward the command deck instead of my quarters, driven by the same stubborn curiosity that had brought me across the boundary in the first place, and no one stopped me. Perhaps they were too focused on the crisis unfolding to worry about one alien cartographer wandering where he technically should not have been. The command deck, when I reached it, was a controlled storm of quiet, focused activity. Captain Cade stood at the center of it, studying a display that showed dozens of incoming contacts, her expression carved from the same calm stone I had come to associate with her, though I could see now, up close, the tension held carefully beneath that calm. "Captain," I said quietly, not wanting to interrupt but unable to stay silent. "What is happening?" She glanced at me briefly, before returning her attention to the display. "The Halcyon Assembly found the breach again," she said. "The same faction that lost their fleet here a century ago has apparently spent the decades since preparing for another attempt. They believe our silence over the last century proves we have weakened further, not less." "How many ships?" 43, by current count, she said. "Considerably more than they brought the first time." I thought of the 11 wrecked cruisers I had passed through on my way in, destroyed so completely that no escape pods had ever launched, and felt a cold dread settle into my chest at the thought of 43 ships believing they could succeed where 11 had already failed so badly. "What will you do?" Captain Cade finally turned to look at me fully, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her eyes that was not calm restraint, but something older, heavier, carrying the weight of a decision she had clearly hoped never to make again. "What we always do when someone mistakes our patience for weakness," she said quietly, "we remind them why the boundary was never meant to be tested twice." Around us, the crew continued their work with the same steady focus I had witnessed since the alarm first sounded. No panic, no hesitation, simply careful, practiced efficiency that told me clearly this was not the first time this ship, and the people aboard it, had prepared for exactly this moment. "I want you to understand something, Vexthal Orun," Captain Cade said, her voice low enough that only I could hear it clearly over the quiet hum of activity surrounding us. "What you are about to witness is not something we take pleasure in. Every ship we destroy today carries people who made a choice to come here, believing us weak enough to conquer. We would have preferred, more than anything, that they simply stayed away." "Why show me this at all?" I asked. "You could have kept me in my quarters, kept me from seeing any of this." She studied me for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a quiet weight I had not expected. "Because you came here looking for the truth behind 300 years of silence, cartographer. I do not think it would be honest of me to show you only the parts of that truth that are comfortable to witness." I nodded slowly, understanding settling over me even as fear continued to tighten in my chest. I had come looking for answers, driven by curiosity and a stubborn refusal to accept old fear without examining it first. I had found warmth, and grief, and quiet strength among people I had once believed vanished entirely. Now, it seemed, I was about to find the other half of the truth as well, the half that explained exactly why every species in known space had learned, without needing to be told twice, never to test this boundary again. On the display before us, the 43 incoming ships continued their approach, confident and unaware of exactly what they were flying toward, while around me, humanity prepared itself once more to answer a question the galaxy kept asking despite every warning already given. What happens to those who assume this silence means weakness? I was about to find out firsthand, and some part of me, quiet and honest beneath the fear, understood that I would never think about the gray veil, or the species hidden carefully behind it, the same way again. Captain Cade gave her orders in a voice so calm it felt almost gentle, and yet every person on that command deck moved the instant she spoke, as though her calm carried more authority than any shout ever could. "Bring the outer defense grid online," she said. "Full power to the relay stations. I want every automated system that has been sitting quiet for the last 40 years back on active duty within 3 minutes." "Understood, Captain," came the reply from a young woman seated near the main console, her fingers already moving across her controls with practiced speed. I stood near the edge of the command deck, doing my best to stay out of the way while still watching everything unfold before me. The steady red pulse of the alarm continued in the background, no longer feeling quite so alien to me now that I understood it as the sound of controlled preparation rather than panic. "Vex," Captain Cade said, without looking away from her display, "you should know that this ship will remain well behind the primary defense line. You are not in immediate danger, though I understand that may not feel entirely reassuring given the circumstances." "I appreciate the honesty," I said, and meant it. On the main display, the 43 incoming ships continued their approach in a loose, confident formation, clearly expecting little meaningful resistance, given the century of silence they had likely observed before committing to this attempt. I found myself studying their formation with the same instinct I brought to every unfamiliar star chart, searching for patterns, trying to understand what I was looking at before it fully arrived. "They are spreading their formation wide," I said aloud, almost without meaning to. "That suggests they expect resistance to come from a single point, and want to avoid presenting one easy target." Captain Cade glanced at me, a flicker of something like approval crossing her face. "A fair read, cartographer. Unfortunately for them, that formation works far better against an enemy who only has one point of resistance to offer." I did not fully understand what she meant until the outer defense grid activated. It began with what looked, at first, like ordinary debris scattered across the region, remnants I had assumed were simply more wreckage left over from the original silent campaign centuries earlier. As the grid powered on, however, that debris began to move, revealing itself not as wreckage at all, but as an enormous network of dormant automated platforms, spread carefully across a region far wider than I had realized, each one now humming quietly to life, after decades of patient stillness. "Ren," I said quietly, "how many of those platforms are there?" "I am counting several hundred distinct signatures," Ren answered, its voice carrying the same quiet astonishment I felt myself. "Vex, this entire region was never simply a graveyard. It was a prepared battlefield, disguised as one." I looked back at Captain Cade, understanding dawning slowly and uncomfortably. "The wreckage, the 11 ships I flew through when I first arrived, that was never left in place purely as a warning, was it? It served two purposes," she said simply. "A warning for those wise enough to heed it, and cover for a defense network we hoped we would never need to use again." The incoming Halcyon fleet, still unaware of what waited for them, continued their confident approach, their wide formation drifting directly into the heart of a trap centuries in the making. I watched, my chest tight with a mixture of dread and reluctant awe, as Captain Cade issued her final order before the engagement began. "Hold position until they cross the inner marker," she said. "Let them commit fully before we respond. I want no possibility of them retreating to warn others before this is finished." The 43 ships crossed that inner marker without any indication they understood what they had just done, and the moment they did, the dormant platforms surrounding them activated all at once. A silent, coordinated response built entirely on patience rather than aggression, until the exact right moment arrived. What followed happened faster than I could properly track, even with Ren recording every detail for me to review later. The automated platforms did not simply attack blindly. They moved with the same eerie precision I had first witnessed in the small drone that intercepted me among the original wreckage, coordinating perfectly with each other, targeting engines and weapon systems with surgical accuracy rather than indiscriminate destruction. "They are disabling ships, not destroying them," I said, watching the display with growing disbelief. "When possible," Captain Cade confirmed. "Destruction is easier, and faster, but it teaches nothing to anyone who might survive to report back. A disabled fleet, towed home in humiliation, carries a lesson that wreckage alone cannot." Not every ship in the attacking fleet received that mercy, however. As the engagement continued, I watched several vessels attempt aggressive countermeasures, refusing to accept the situation they found themselves in, continuing to fire on the platforms surrounding them despite the clear futility of the effort. Those ships, I noticed, did not survive the encounter the way the others did. "Why do some receive different treatment than others?" I asked quietly. "Because restraint only extends as far as the other side allows it to," Captain Cade said, her voice carrying no satisfaction in the answer, only quiet, weary acceptance. "We do not enjoy this, Vexthal Orun, but we have learned, at great cost, that mercy offered without limits simply becomes another form of weakness for others to exploit." The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes from beginning to end, though it felt far longer standing on that command deck, watching decades of careful, patient preparation finally put to use against an enemy who had clearly never imagined the silence they exploited was itself a kind of trap. When it was finished, the display showed a fleet reduced from 43 confident ships to a scattered handful of disabled, drifting vessels, their crews likely alive, likely humiliated, likely already composing the same kind of desperate, frightened recordings I had discovered among the original wreckage centuries earlier. Captain Cade allowed herself a single, quiet breath of relief before turning back to her crew, already issuing new orders, already shifting focus toward securing the disabled ships and ensuring no further escalation would follow. "Ren," I said softly, still staring at the display. "Record everything. Every detail. I want this preserved exactly as it happened." "Already done, Vex," Ren replied. I turned to find Captain Cade watching me, her expression unreadable, waiting perhaps to see how I would react to everything I had just witnessed. I thought of the wreckage I had first flown through, the whispering that had frightened me, the warmth and grief and quiet strength I had discovered among people the rest of the galaxy had convinced itself no longer existed. I thought of 43 ships that had come here confident, expecting weakness, and found instead exactly what centuries of patient restraint had been protecting the galaxy from ever provoking again. "You asked me once what I planned to do with the truth you gave me," I said quietly. "I remember," she said. "I think I finally understand it well enough to answer that question," I said, "but I do not think you will like everything my answer includes." Captain Cade studied me for a long moment, and then, to my surprise, something almost like a tired smile crossed her face. "Somehow, cartographer, that does not surprise me at all. In the days following the battle, I watched humanity handle victory with the same careful restraint they had shown in preparing for it, and that restraint taught me more about them than the fighting itself ever could. The disabled Halkran ships were not looted, not destroyed out of spite, not paraded as trophies the way I might have expected from a species finally proving their strength after a century of doubted silence. Instead, Captain Cade ordered basic repairs to their life support systems, enough to keep every surviving crew member alive and stable, before setting their navigation systems toward the nearest Halkran outpost and releasing them, along with a single recorded message I was permitted to hear before it was sent. "You came believing our silence meant weakness," the recording said, spoken by Captain Cade herself, her voice calm and without malice. "We hope you return home, understanding that silence and weakness are not the same thing, and that the boundary you crossed exists to protect far more than it appears to threaten. We will not offer this mercy a third time." I sat with that message for a long while after hearing it, turning it over in my mind the way I once turned over unfamiliar star charts, searching for meaning beneath the surface details. "Why let them go at all?" I asked Captain Cade later, as we walked together through a quiet section of the ship still recovering from the tension of the previous days. "You had every advantage. You could have ended the threat completely, made certain no faction within the Halkran Assembly would ever consider trying again." "We considered that," she admitted. "Every generation that has faced a moment like this one considers it. But total destruction teaches only fear, and fear, as I told you before, is a poison that spreads far beyond its intended target. A defeated fleet returning home with their lives, and their humiliation, teaches something far more useful. It teaches respect, built on demonstrated restraint rather than demonstrated cruelty. And if respect fails, if they simply return again, better prepared, then we will be here again, better prepared as well," she said simply. "That is the quiet arithmetic we have lived by for 300 years, cartographer. It is not perfect, it is not comfortable, but it is the only balance we have found that lets us remain both safe, and more importantly, still recognizably ourselves." I thought of everything I had witnessed since crossing the boundary, the wreckage disguised as both warning and weapon, the calm efficiency of a crew preparing for violence they clearly took no pleasure in, the deliberate mercy shown even toward an enemy who had come seeking their destruction. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand what the Grey Veil truly protected, and it was not simply the galaxy's safety from humanity's strength. "The boundary protects you from yourselves as much as it protects everyone else from you," I said slowly, testing the thought aloud. Captain Cade stopped walking and turned to look at me, something like quiet approval crossing her face. "Now you understand," she said. "Power without restraint eventually consumes whoever holds it, no matter how good their original intentions were. We saw that truth clearly enough during the Silent Campaign to build our entire existence around avoiding it ever since." We continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, passing crew members going about their ordinary routines, children laughing somewhere in the distance, life continuing on despite everything that had just occurred. It struck me, watching it all, how easily this entire existence could be mistaken for defeat by anyone who never bothered to look closely enough to see the truth underneath it. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "To me, specifically, I have seen more than any outsider has been permitted to see in 3 centuries. I imagine that creates a problem for you." Captain Cade considered the question carefully before answering. "It does," she admitted. Ordinarily, we would remove the memory of these coordinates before releasing anyone who reached this deeply into our territory. The same mercy we extended to the 2 peaceful visitors who came before you. My chest tightened at the thought. And now I find myself uncertain, she said honestly. You did not come here seeking conquest, or proof of our weakness. You came seeking truth, and stayed long enough to understand it far more completely than either of those first 2 visitors ever did. That complicates the decision considerably. I thought of my own people, safely ignorant across dozens of Concord systems, still believing the old stories, still marking this region unknown, a void, without ever understanding why beyond inherited instinct. I thought of the wreckage, and the whispering, and the warmth I had found among people the galaxy had convinced itself no longer existed. I thought of 43 ships released with mercy instead of destroyed with vengeance, and the quiet, careful balance humanity had maintained for 300 years, without a single outsider ever fully understanding the cost of maintaining it. I do not want my memory erased, I said finally, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. But I also do not think I want to carry this truth home exactly as I understand it now either. Captain Cade raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. The Concord believes you are gone, or weak, or something to be feared without understanding, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it aloud. None of that is true, but none of the full truth is safe to share either, not completely. If I bring home proof of everything I witnessed here, curiosity like mine will only multiply. More scouts will come looking, some peaceful, some far less so, and eventually, mercy like you showed today may run out entirely. That is a fair concern, Captain Cade said quietly. But if I bring home nothing at all, I continued, the old fear simply continues unchanged, inherited blindly for another 300 years, without ever being understood or respected the way it deserves to be. What are you suggesting, cartographer? I looked at her for a long moment, an idea slowly taking shape in my mind, one that felt both reckless and, somehow, exactly right given everything I had learned since crossing the boundary that had once terrified me simply because I did not understand it. I am suggesting a compromise, I said, one that respects the balance you have spent 3 centuries maintaining, while finally giving that balance the honest foundation it has always deserved, instead of the blind, inherited fear it has survived on until now. Captain Cade studied me carefully, weighing my words the same way she had weighed every decision I had witnessed her make since the moment we first met. Finally, she nodded slowly, gesturing for me to continue. Tell me exactly what you have in mind, she said, and I will decide whether it is wisdom or foolishness disguised as wisdom, before I let you anywhere near a transmitter capable of reaching the Concord. I took a slow breath, gathering my thoughts carefully, understanding fully that whatever I said next would shape not only my own future, but potentially the future of every interaction between my people and hers for generations to come. I do not propose giving the Concord your exact coordinates, or the full details of your defenses, or even confirmation that you remain as strong as you clearly are, I said carefully. That knowledge, spread carelessly, would only invite exactly the kind of danger you have spent 3 centuries avoiding. Captain Cade said nothing, waiting for me to continue, her expression unreadable but her attention fully fixed on my words. Instead, I said, I propose telling a smaller truth, not the full story, but enough of one, that humanity did not vanish through defeat, but through deliberate choice. That the boundary exists because you chose restraint over dominance, not because you were forced into hiding by something stronger than yourselves. Enough truth to earn respect instead of blind fear, without enough detail to invite exactly the kind of foolish challenge that brought 43 ships here believing you weak. A careful truth, Captain Cade said slowly, considering it. Enough to change the story, without enough to become a new kind of danger itself. Exactly, I said. The old fear kept the Concord away for 3 centuries, but blind fear is unstable. It fades over time, the way it clearly did for the faction within the Halcyon Assembly that attacked you today. A truth built on genuine respect, however, tends to last considerably longer, because it is founded on understanding rather than simple ignorance. Captain Cade walked slowly toward a nearby viewport, looking out at the stars beyond it, silent for a long moment as she turned my proposal over in her mind. I waited, understanding that whatever she decided next would carry consequences far beyond my own small life. You realize, she said finally without turning around, that even a careful truth carries risk. Some among your own people may not believe restraint was truly a choice. Others may see it exactly as an opportunity, regardless of how carefully you frame it. I understand that risk, I said. But I do not believe blind fear, inherited without understanding for another 3 centuries, is truly safer. Fear like that eventually fades on its own, the way it did for the Halcyon faction that attacked you, and when it fades without understanding to replace it, the result is exactly what we witnessed here. Confident ignorance, arriving expecting weakness, finding strength instead, and paying a price that could have been avoided entirely, with a little more honesty shared a little sooner. Captain Cade turned back to face me, and for a long moment, she studied me in silence. The same careful, evaluating look she had given me the very first time we met aboard my small ship among the wreckage. "You have changed considerably since you first crossed our boundary, cartographer," she said finally. "The person who flew in here was driven by pride, and a stubborn refusal to accept fear without testing it personally. The person standing in front of me now seems driven by something else entirely." "Understanding, I hope," I said, though I imagine pride and stubbornness had their uses in getting me far enough to find it. A small, genuine smile crossed her face, the first I had seen from her that carried no trace of weariness or calculation behind it. "I will need to discuss your proposal with our council before any final decision is made," she said. "This is not a choice I am willing to make entirely on my own, given everything it could mean for our future." "I understand," I said. "Take whatever time you need." The council's deliberation lasted several days, during which I continued documenting everything I had witnessed, not for the Concord's official archives, but for a smaller, more careful record I hoped might one day serve the exact purpose I had proposed to Captain Cade. When the council finally reached their decision, it was Captain Cade herself who delivered it to me, finding me in my quarters late one evening, reviewing translated fragments of old relay traffic with Ren beside me. "We have decided to allow your proposal," she said without preamble, stepping into the small room. "A careful truth, carrying respect without dangerous detail, released through whatever channels you believe will reach the Concord most credibly." Relief washed through me, followed quickly by the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. "Thank you," I said. "I will not waste the trust you are extending." "See that you do not," she said, though her tone carried warmth rather than warning. "You will be given safe passage back to the boundary within the week. Your memory will remain intact, a trust we have not extended to any outsider in 3 centuries. I hope, for both our sakes, that trust proves as wise as I currently believe it to be." In the days that followed, before my departure, I spent as much time as I could documenting the small, ordinary details of human life that I knew would never make it into any official record. The laughter shared over meals, the quiet grief honored openly rather than hidden away, the stubborn ingenuity of engineers like Owen Marsh keeping centuries-old systems running through nothing but patience and creativity. I wanted to remember all of it, not just the wreckage and the battle, but the warmth that existed quietly alongside them both. On the morning of my departure, Captain Cade escorted me personally back to the lonely cartographer, walking beside me in silence through corridors that had become, in the span of a few short weeks, almost familiar to me. "I have one final request," I said, as we reached the airlock separating her ship from mine. "Ask it," she said. "When I return home, and share the careful truth we agreed upon, I do not intend to include the exact coordinates of this boundary, or any detail specific enough to guide another scout directly here, the way Doran Vell's data chip guided me. But I would like your permission to keep my own complete record, unshared, in case a day ever comes when the full truth becomes necessary to protect both our peoples rather than endanger them." Captain Cade considered this for a long moment, studying me with the same careful evaluation she had shown from our very first meeting. "Keep your record, cartographer," she said finally. "I trust you understand the weight of what you would be protecting, and the responsibility that comes with deciding, one day, whether that weight ever needs to be shared more widely." "I understand," I said quietly, "and I hope that day never comes." "So do I," she said, and for the first time since we had met, I saw something almost like genuine warmth in her expression. "Safe travels, Vexthal Arun. I do not imagine we will meet again, but I find myself glad, all the same, that we met at all." I stepped through the airlock back onto my own ship, and as the docking tube disengaged and Captain Cade's vessel drifted slowly away, I sat in the small, familiar cabin of the lonely cartographer and allowed myself, finally, a long, unsteady breath. Ren's voice broke the silence gently. "Setting course for the boundary, Vex. Shall I prepare the standard exit transmission?" "Yes," I said. "But Ren, before we go, I want you to seal my complete records under my personal authorization only. Not the Concord archive, just mine." "Understood," Ren said. "May I ask what you intend to share instead?" I looked out at the stars ahead of me, the same scattered light that had once seemed empty and unremarkable, before I understood what waited quietly behind it. "The truth," I said. "Just not all of it, not yet." As my ship crossed back over the boundary, leaving the gray veil behind me for what I believed, at the time, would be the last occasion of my life, I understood that I was returning home, changed in ways I had not expected when I first stole a data chip from a retired scout who had laughed while handing it over. I had come looking for proof that old fear was foolish and outdated. I had found instead a truth far more complicated and far more human than any story the Concord had ever told about the silence beyond the veil. Humanity had not vanished because they were weak, and they had not remained hidden because they were monstrous. They had chosen silence, deliberately and at great personal cost, to protect a fragile balance between their own considerable strength and the safety of every species around them, including, whether the Concord ever fully understood it or not, my own. I did not know, sitting there watching the boundary fade behind me on my sensors, whether the careful truth I intended to share would strengthen that balance or eventually threaten it. I only knew that blind fear, inherited without understanding, had already proven itself dangerous once. In the confident, doomed approach of 43 ships that believed silence meant weakness, I intended to make certain, as best I could, that such a mistake was never repeated quite so easily again. And somewhere behind me, quiet and patient as it had been for 300 years, the gray veil settled back into its careful, watchful silence, waiting, as it always had, for whoever might be foolish, or brave, or curious enough to test it next.